When you receive your sampling kit, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have all items needed to facilitate a successful sample. The first item is your documentation packet, which includes your checklist, chain of custody, and custody seals. This is followed by a roll of paper towels, your aluminum pan and plastic scoop, the DVD that you are actually watching, sample container A, sample container B, a roll of packing tape, your gloves, and 2 large trash bags. One of the most important processes in a sample collection is properly completing the documentation. Remove all documents from the documentation packet. These documents include 2 custody seals, a chain of custody form, index cards, which you can refer to throughout this program, a water-based mud sampling procedure, a water-based mud sampling checklist, and a completed FedEx U.S. air bill. Once you've got these taken out, remove the sample container from the bag, and you're going to properly label these by dating it, putting the time on it, and initialing it, as seen here. Then you will need to remove the second sample container and do the same thing, always focusing on the highlighted parts. Every single highlighted piece needs to be completed before you have completed and filled all documentation required. Notice here, he has again dated it, timed it, and initialed it. Once he's completed the sample containers, he moves on to the chain of custody form, where he again dates it and places the time of the sample collection. He then will print his name. This is a very important part. You must print your name, and then after printing your name, you're going to sign it on the same line. Then underneath it, you will sign it again, and date and time, completing all highlighted parts on this form. The next step is to complete the 2 custody seals. There are 2 of them in this process, which must be dated and timed with a signature that occurs underneath both. Repeat this step again by completing the highlighted parts with the date, the time, and the signature. You're then going to pull out your checklist and take a look at what has been done so far. Earlier in this program, we made sure that all items were included in the sampling kit. So check those items off. And as we went down the list, we also included or made sure that all documentation was properly completed. So we're going to check those off on the checklist at this time. Remember, use this checklist throughout the program to ensure all steps are properly completed. After making sure that we have everything in the sampling kit and the documentation is properly filled out, we want to make sure that we prep the cooler properly as well. The first step in prepping the cooler is making sure that if you have a FedEx air bill, if you have one, that you actually place it on top of the cooler and make sure that it is properly sealed accordingly. This will make sure that the cooler goes to the laboratory and make sure it gets to where it's supposed to get. The next step in prepping the cooler is making sure that you provide not one, but a double bag process for ensuring that the samples stay cool and on ice. So what you're going to do is open up one of the trash bags, put it into the cooler, then you're going to open up the other trash bag and place it in the cooler as well. Again, double bagged. It's very important that we use 2 bags. 2 bags will ensure that we have proper containment throughout the whole transportation process. Once you have both bags in the cooler, you're then going to fill the bags with ice. Now, we want to make sure that we have enough room for all containers that are being collected. So don't overfill the cooler. Make sure the cooler is about half full, and make sure that the ice is loose enough for you to take all the containers and place them in the overall cooler. Once you have the ice in the bags, the cooler prepped, you're then going to refer again to the checklist, again providing an opportunity for you to document that the process has been successfully completed, and you're going to check off this process. If you notice at this point, we are about halfway through the sampling process. The next step is making sure that we collect the sample properly. After gathering your 2 sample containers, what you're going to do is make sure that we do not contaminate the sample, so we put on a pair of gloves. These gloves will not only protect the sample, but will also protect you. One thing that you may want to remember is extra gloves have been provided so that if your gloves do get torn or dirty during the process, you can replace them at any time. Once the gloves have been donned properly, you're going to want to get your mud. Now, water-based mud samples should be collected from the return mud from the well borehole during the riser installation. If this is not possible because the water-based mud will not be used after riser installation, water-based mud from an active pit with mud discharged on the sea floor will be collected instead. It is very important that you make notes on the checklist to show where the sample was collected. Once you've got the mud, you begin filling the sample container up to the proper fill line. For time's sake, we have sped this up until he reaches the fill line. Once that fill line has been reached, you're going to make sure to wipe off the container properly. That means we want you to remove all excess water-based mud from the outside of the container. This may take several wipes for you to do so. Remember to focus on the outside of the container, wiping around the rim of the container, making sure it is as clean as possible. Once this process has been completed, you're going to repeat the process, making sure that you have 2 full sample containers, meaning completely filled to the fill line, sample A and sample B containers. When you have 2 filled containers, you're then going to make sure that the bag sample A matches the container sample A. And then you're going to put sample A in the bag labeled sample A. Now notice his technique for doing so. Because you will be packing this in a cooler, you need to remove the air from the bag as best as possible. That means zip the bag halfway full and then push the air out, completing the zip. He'll do it again here. Notice he's matching sample B to sample B, and then he'll put the sample B container inside the bag, zip it halfway through, push the air out, and then completely zip the bag up again. This again will make sure all air is out of the bag and will allow for you to properly package your sample containers. Once you've sealed the second container, you're going to refer back to your checklist where you're going to do 3 things. The first thing is you're going to check off that you used a pair of gloves. The second is that you're going to check off that you've completely filled 2 bottles. And the last thing, which is one of the most important aspects, you must identify where the sample was collected from. One other thing we want you to consider, you may be asked to provide duplicate samples. And if you are asked to provide duplicate samples, that means you must do this process all over from the very beginning. That means a new tray, new scoop, and 2 new bottles which will be labeled dupe, D-U-P, A and B. They will also be provided in the bags, and not only, this is very important, the process must be repeated from the very beginning, which means you need to don a new pair of gloves, you need to get new mud, and you need to scoop that mud into 2 new containers at the fill lines labeled dupe A and dupe B, and then put them in the bags as well. Upon completing the dupe process, you will not have 2 bottles, rather you will have 4 bottles completely filled with the water-based mud. Now that the samples have been collected, we must make sure that we package the samples properly so they do not leak during the shipping process. To do this, we want to make sure that all Ziploc bags have all excess air removed from them so that they can be easily packed. We also want to make sure that regardless of how many containers we put in the cooler, that all the lids are securely tightened. Notice here how the air is removed from the Ziploc bag, and then the lid is tightened to make sure that samples do not leak during the shipping process. As you pack your cooler, you're going to want to make sure that all samples are not touching each other. So all sample containers are about 1 inch apart with plenty of ice between them. This is a very important step to make sure that the samples do remain intact during the shipping process. The next step is to make sure that the cooler is completely filled with ice. So you're going to want to top the cooler off with ice to make sure the samples remain cool during the shipping process. After topping the cooler off with ice, you have 2 bags. Remember, 2 bags that must be tied independent of one another, which means the first thing you're going to do is in the inner bag, you're going to remove all air from the bag and you're going to tie it. Once this is tied, you will have some excess bag remaining, and you're going to want to tuck that excess back into the outer bag. So if you notice here, he's tucking it down. As he tucks it down, he's then going to grab the outer bag, and what he's going to do is he's going to remove the air again there so that no excess bag is on the outside of the cooler. He's going to remove the air, and he's going to tie the bag again. Once this is tied, he's going to tuck the remaining excess of the bag into the cooler, and he's going to make sure he tapes this down. It's very important that this excess is taped down so that you don't have trash bags hanging outside of the sample cooler. At this step, it would be very helpful if you had something sharp so that you can actually cut the tape instead of struggling to pull a piece off. Again, he's going to tape the remaining excess of the trash bags down to ensure they do not pop outside of the cooler during the shipping process. The next step you're going to want to do is make sure your documentation is properly completed. He's going to remove his gloves and take a look at the sample custody form, making sure that all highlighted areas have been completed. Again, this is a double check. There should be no items needed to be completed at this stage. You will have done this earlier, but you are going to double check and make sure that you've completed all highlighted areas. Once this is done, you're going to go to your checklist, make sure that all items above it have been checked off, and once you have checked off all items, you're going to check the last box, which is the packaging of the samples. You're going to sign your name. You're going to print your name, and you're going to provide the date. This documentation is extremely important in the sample process and must be packaged properly with the sample before being shipped. After completing this step, please place both of these documents inside the documentation packet. And please also include the instruction index cards as well. You're going to want to seal the Ziploc bag. And at this point, we are going to take this documentation packet and place it on top of the cooler, on the inside. It's very important on the inside so it is not lost during the shipping process. To do this, what you're going to do is take the documentation packet. You're going to fold it in half. It's okay to fold the documentation packet in half, and you're going to tape it to the top of the inside of the cooler, as seen here. Again, this is very important. All documentation must accompany samples to the laboratory environment. Once you've completed this process, you're going to close the cooler, and now we're going to make sure that we do the last step, which is very important. We're going to want to make sure that we have two custody seals that are attached on two sides of the cooler. They got to be opposite sides. So on the corner of one side, and then on the opposite side of that, you're going to place another custody seal. These are very, very important. At this point, we're going to want to make sure that the packaging tape goes over the custody seal so it is not removed during the shipping process. To do this, you're going to take the shipping tape and you're going to go around the cooler over the custody seal 3 to 4 times, as shown here. This will not only make sure the cooler remains sealed during the shipping process, but will also secure the custody seal as well. Again, at this point, it would be very helpful if you had a pair of scissors to cut the shipping tape. Once you've completed the first custody seal, remember you must do this again with the second custody seal. Again, securing the cooler, making sure that it is not open during the shipping process, but also making sure that the custody seals remain intact during the overall shipping process. Once you've made sure that the custody seals have been properly secured to the cooler, you are now ready to hand the sample cooler to the individual who will transport it to shore.